Station.
Today is Monday, March 17th. It's the third episode of our Shea Station team profile and projection. We're tackling all the position units on the Mets, and we've done all the position players. We did outfield, we did infield. If you missed those episodes, go check them out. Leave them some love. We'd appreciate it. Now we're tackling Jerry Blevin's bread and butter, the Mets bullpen, a former member on the podcast here today. A lot of interesting options in the pen, a lot of moves made already, a lot of spring training standouts. This is going to be a fun deep dive for the real Mets freaks that listen to this show. We're going to get into everybody. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm with, of course, Jerry Blevins. Jerry, how you doing?
Great. Happy to be here. This is, bread and butter here, talking about the bullpen, and it's a good one. I think the Mets have arguably the best bullpen in the division.
Ooh.
I know the Braves have a solid core of guys, but the Phillies are lacking a little bit, I would say, especially at the back end. But with Edwin Diaz holding it down, I expect him to take another step towards that dominance he showed in 2022. Got to shake the rust off for a full season, comes in fully healthy. I like what I see as far as depth, high end back of the bullpen arms, and then some depth. So I like it.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the Mets have 10 legitimate major league options in their bullpen right now, which is a good thing to have because that means 3 guys probably aren't making the cut and you have backups for injuries and stuff like that. I like that you opened with a bold claim because bullpen moves were made around the division. The Phillies most notably brought in Jordan Romano after he was non-tendered by the Blue Jays. The Braves running back mostly the same unit, except they brought in an old enemy, Hector Neris, who was a Philly, then a Cub, then an Astro, and now back in the division with the Atlanta Braves.
Maybe back.
Oh yeah, true. Non-roster invitee. We'll see. I have him making the club, but we'll see. Maybe that's just name value. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, speaking of name value, I think that's a great transition because last year, when you listen to our preseason and early season pods, all we talked about was, our bullpen's going to be so good because David Stearns is in charge, and this is what he does. He makes bullpens out of nothing. And the names were surely not household names. I mean, a lot of guys that got innings last year were Dednail Nunez, who was not in my book until he was on the mound for my team. Danny Young got 40 innings from the Mets last year. Jose Budo was a massive piece of the bullpen. But entering the year, I mean, the only real guy with name value in this bullpen was Edwin Diaz, and he was perhaps the biggest question mark. A year removed from that, I feel a lot better about this unit, especially considering what they accomplished in the second half after a really poor first half from pretty much everybody involved. So we're going to go through all the guys, but just to give you guys a rundown of who's projected currently to make this bullpen, closing games will be Edwin Diaz, the most highly paid closer in the game right now, looking for a bounce back year, or I guess just a return to form year for him because last year wasn't bad necessarily, just ups and downs. Jose Budo getting setup duties. He was a massive piece last year. We thought maybe he'd get a look at the rotation again. The Mets are steadfast in having him be a long relief stopper kind of guy back there. Reed Garrett, the other setup option, really probably the best year out of anyone in the bullpen last year, in my opinion. I mean, the ups and downs were certainly there, but he had really, I think, the most memorable year at least. Ryan Stanik back in the fold on a 1-year deal after acquiring him at the deadline. He wanted to come home, which is really cool to see. Danny Young exists right now as the only lefty legitimate option in the bullpen, so that's going to be interesting. Maybe an area of improvement for the Mets. Max Kranick, who's been turning some heads in spring training, is currently slated to make the Mets bullpen. We'll see if Roster Resource nailed that one on the head. And then the last two in the pen, Paul Blackburn, currently not in a rotation spot, and Genesis Cabrera, who spent time with the Cardinals and Blue Jays. But there are many options outside of that, including Dednail Nunez, who we mentioned before. Is there any one guy you want to hone in on to start this discussion?
Well, I think we just run it down from the back, starting with Edwin Diaz, and then work our way, based off of high leverage. But with Diaz, he had not as dominant of a year. I mean, according to Fangraphs here, he was the 23rd ranked relief pitcher. That's not what you want from Edwin Diaz as far as, what you're paying him to do, the eliteness that he showed in 2022 of being arguably the greatest reliever on the planet. I still think those are his expectations to come be a top 5 guy, be a shutdown closer. He was good enough, obviously, to advance. He still got swing and miss stuff. But I would like to see him sharpen in, get that slider consistently working, stay away from the walks. I still believe in what he's capable of doing, and I think he's an excellent addition and, one of the top 10 guys I would want, even in today's world, coming off of season that was, again, this is a harsh for Edwin Diaz, but he set the bar so high. He's one of the 10 guys that I would choose to be, my closer.
Yeah, I mean, I still view him as a top relief pitcher in the game. You're going to have those erratic outings where he walks the first 2 batters and strikes out the next 3 because that's kind of become part of his brand. But yeah, I truly wonder if 2022, that caliber of season is still in the tank. Just to refresh everyone's memory, because there's a lot of Edwin Diaz discourse these days. In 2022, he threw 62 innings and allowed 9 earned runs on the entire season. He struck out 118 batters to just 18 walks. That's a 17.1 K per 9. He finished top 10 in Cy Young voting. He was the only reliever in the National League to finish in the top 10, a 1.31 ERA and 3.2 WAR. He was superb. He was arguably the best player on that team. And, he had an unfortunate injury in the World Baseball Classic, came back last year and had a really tough start to the season, especially in May, where he had that stretch of blown saves. I still remember the one in Miami with the 4-run lead. That was a devastating loss for the Mets in the midst of many devastating losses that month. And then for me, the season really started for him. I don't know if you remember this, but it was that save against the San Diego Padres. The Mets came home. They had just walked off the Marlins to scrape out that series win. They had a 2-1 lead. Diaz hadn't had a save in 40 days. He'd locked down that save, and then I feel like his season really got going from there. And you saw flashes of dominance in the postseason for Edwin Diaz as well. He put together a pretty solid postseason run, including 5 1/3 shutout innings against the Dodgers when basically no one else on the Mets could hold them at bay. I have high expectations for Edwin Diaz this year. I think his projection right now is a little low for what I wanted of him. They're projecting him at a 1 WAR, a 2.94 ERA, 65 innings. That's all great. But for him to truly be worth this $20 million price tag, he needs to return somewhat close to that 2022 form. And I still believe that's in there because the velocity is still there. His slider is still one of the best in the game when he has control of it. And he needs to kind of lead the charge on this bullpen. Things really started to fall apart last year when Edwin Diaz faltered because it was like the head of the snake got cut off and suddenly Reed Garrett was in safe situations. Suddenly Jose Budo was thrown 2 innings back-to-back days and stuff like that. When Edwin Diaz is in order, the rest of the bullpen takes form.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there. He has to be the solid closer that he's shown in order for everybody else to fit into a comfortable role. And I'm glad you brought up Reed Garrett because I think he's that 8th inning guy. He showed last year that he couldn't handle the 9th inning, and there's nothing wrong with that because he is an elite setup guy. His ability to come in, bring that energy, bring that lightning in a barrel kind of stuff that he has, he slides into that 8th inning role very well. I like Reed Garrett as a setup guy. I think he's one of the best in the league when he stays there, and he'll be a key piece. Again, this bullpen, you'll need contributions and a lot of innings because not just because of the starting rotation and the injuries with Minaya, with Montas going down, but you got Kodai Senga coming off 1 start from the season before. You got David Peterson in his first full season after hip surgery. You have Clay Holmes, his first time as a starter since 2019?
2018.
So you're going to need these guys. None of these guys are 200 inning guys, especially with Minaya going down. You'd be lucky to get 180 out of all of them. But you're probably more in the 150 to 165 era of starters, and you're going to need a lot of depth, and that's one thing that this bullpen has is depth. And you mentioned Max Kranick, but I kind of want to keep going down. Where do you think Reed Garrett fits in? Is he the 7th, 8th inning guy?
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting because usually that guy will get save opportunities, and I wonder if the Mets deploy him that way. I mean, Reed Garrett's start to the season last year was absolutely incredible. I believe it was 20 innings and 2 earned runs allowed throughout the first month. And even with the ups and downs and him getting, put in leverage spots and then relegated to, middle relief and stuff like that, him and Edwin Diaz still ranked out as one of the best bullpen duos in baseball last year. I mean, they were both top 10 in strikeout per nine. Diaz was third, Garrett was eighth. They both ranked in the top 10 for soft contact percentage. Diaz was 10th, Reed was third. And then whiff percentage, both top 15. Reed was 15th. Diaz was seventh. So, I mean, that combination as your eighth and ninth inning guys is pretty special. And they held up a huge end of the bargain with Reed throwing 57 innings, Diaz throwing 53. You got to remember, Reed, as I think a 31-year-old last year, never really had major league time at all. His sample leading into that season was roughly 40 innings, and none of it was particularly good. So to get that quality of season out of Reed Garrett was really special. He has one of the most devastating splitters in the game. He has a lights-out fastball. He's throwing as hard as Edwin Diaz. So yeah, in my mind, he profiles as that eighth inning guy, and that's what I want him to be and expect him to be, honestly, because the other piece of that in my mind is Jose Budo, who I think is kind of going to get deployed similarly to what he did last year. You're going to see Budo in long relief some days. Sometimes you're going to get a bases loaded 1-out situation in the sixth inning, and Budo is going to get deployed there because they're going to want to save their back end guys to the back end. He kind of feels like that Swiss Army knife that's probably going to rack up more innings, maybe get a start when necessary, and sort of just be the everyman of the Mets bullpen.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Jose Budo really shined last year in that role. He did have some growing pains there. So he's the biggest question mark as far as the back end of the bullpen goes for me. And he is going to be very important for them to have success. I think they have the depth to feel if he takes a step back from this role and isn't quite as effective because he has spates of wildness and he has ineffectiveness that goes with it. But I really think he's an important piece of this bullpen, one that you can count on. But he is obviously the biggest question mark because can you repeat it? Being in the bullpen, getting some film on you, guys are going to see and know how you're going to deploy your stuff. He's got the biggest question mark, but I think he's good enough to fill that role.
Yeah, you mentioned the erratic nature of Jose Budo. It was kind of the erratic nature of the entire bullpen. I wanted to go with those three guys first because they feel like locks, and then we'll talk about everybody else. But before we do that, just to demonstrate how volatile this bullpen was, they were the number one bullpen last year in strikeout per nine at a 10.6 rate, which is remarkable. They were also bottom three in the league, right down there with the Rockies and White Sox in walk per nine at 4.1. One thing I'd love to see this year is just less extremes with that. It's tough when you're getting leverage innings and it feels like there's no guy in that bullpen that you can really rely on to not issue a free pass at any given moment, because even our most reliable guys, all of them had walk issues because their stuff was so nasty and they relied on chase. It's why the Mets pitching staff did such a great job against the Phillies in the playoffs, because that is a team that loves to swing and will chase if you can get them to. And that's why they really faltered against the Dodgers, who are a much more disciplined team who thrive on base and work counts to get pitches that they can mash. One thing I wanted to highlight before we get into more guys here, the first half and second half splits, the two things that opened my eye, the walk per nine was the same in terms of where they ranked. They were bottom 10 in the league. They went from a 231 average against, which was bottom half of the league, to a 202 average against in the second half, which was second in the league. So I think that they were able to, hone in their game plan and, generate more whiffs that way and just deploy their relievers and their arsenals in a more effective way from first half to second half. Or it was just baseball kind of, unfurling the way it does and things evening out. But point being, this is a Mets bullpen that will rely on the swing and miss a ton. And that can be lethal and generate tons of strikeouts late in games, or it can lead to very costly free passes. So I want to talk about some guys here that are not so much locks to make the team and what they bring to the table. Do you have any place you want to start here?
Well, I want to start with Stanik. I think he's the guy slated in underneath that could fill in on that eighth inning role, even the ninth inning if Diaz needs a break. He's got that elite fastball. He's got the most experience out of anybody else in this group. I love that they brought him back. He is very volatile because he'll go through rough patches, and we saw it when they traded for him. He came over. He struggled mightily in the regular season, and then really honed in the playoffs in the most important and most impactful moments. He was dominant. I love what he brings to the table. This is a guy that you can ride as a hot hand, and Carlos Mendoza does a tremendous job of understanding the ebbs and flows of certain players. And when Stanik is on, you'll see him slide into that eighth inning role because when he's at his best, he's unhittable. And then you'll see him struggle a little bit. And Mendoza, again, does an amazing job of allowing a guy to pitch in a little bit lower leverage situation, get his feet back on him, and then move him back into that role. Mendoza is one of the best in the leagues at doing it, especially as such a inexperienced big league manager. But Stanik is the epitome of a hot and cold kind of guy. And you need a manager that has faith in you, that shows confidence in you, that's willing to throw you in situations even when you're not consistently, because Mendoza understands that the season's long and you can't just sit a guy, for 10 days, 12 days at a time and expect him to come back and be that guy. So Stanik, I think, is the logical guy that we talk about next because he's going to be on the team throwing big innings regardless.
I think Stanik is the biggest X factor in this bullpen. You mentioned the hot and cold stuff. He was a guy that got hot at the perfect time. He became, arguably the most reliable reliever in the Mets bullpen on their playoff run. It looked like he just took form when October rolled around. And you mentioned, guys like Jose Budo, who I think probably has a chip on his shoulder this year, because last year, the way that it ended for him was nearly blowing the wild card game and then, putting forth some of his worst performances of the year where the Mets needed him the most. So that's kind of the difference with experience, I think. Budo, this was his first major league season. He was one of the most relied upon guys in the pen, and he faltered when we needed him the most. Whereas Stanik, a guy that had been on all those deep Astros playoff runs and really struggled in the regular season, found his form under the brightest lights. And he's another guy that came back and said he always wanted to come back, and he said that the Mets took good care of his family, and that meant a lot to him. It speaks to the culture that they're building there as well. So I'm very happy to have a guy like Ryan Stanik back in the fold. Again, projections are a little bit soft on him, but it helps to have a veteran back there. Like Diaz has the experience, but I think he's just kind of a different case entirely. Stanik's always kind of been in this role. He's always been middle relief, set up ceiling, sometimes getting closing opportunities, but a guy that's going to, pound the zone, try and beat you with heat. And when he does that, it's really fun to watch.
I agree. I kind of want to go to Daniel Nunez from here. He's Roster Resources, Fangraphs gets a lot of things right. Yeah. I cannot see a scenario where if Daniel Nunez is healthy, he is not in the big leagues.
This was the biggest shock for me on the Roster Resource out of everything on the Mets page.
Yeah, this is shocking to me. He played such an important role. He ended up getting hurt because they rode him so hard for a good chunk of that season. He came back and then had some issues with his arm again, but he plays a pivotal role in this bullpen for me. So I think he's the guy I want to talk about next.
Yeah, Nunez is really interesting. I know I just said Stanik's one of the biggest X factors. Nunez is right up there with him because health is going to be a major concern. But yeah, you mentioned that they rode his arm pretty rough here. From June 2nd to July 23rd, which is about, let's say, 6 weeks, Nunez threw in 18 games. He threw 24 innings after never pitching in the big leagues before. And I think he was rapidly approaching his career high for innings as well. In the minors, he had thrown 44, 40, 33, 57, and then he was at 35 innings in July last year after a late call-up. So I think it was just a matter of stamina and building that arm up. And, that is going to be a concern for a lot of these guys in the Mets bullpen. Another guy that got recently outrighted off the 40-man roster and reassigned to AAA is Sean Reed-Foley, who every time he's healthy, we love watching him pitch, but he can never stay healthy. So I think you're going to see a lot of that this year. The Mets have electric guys back there, and it's just a matter of how many innings can you get out of them and how much can you rely on them. Nunez is a case in point here. He's, an age 28 guy, another guy picked off the scrap heap by the New York Mets, just a found guy, and he was essential last year, especially when things were getting tough in May. He came up in June and really found his role and came up and was a stabilizer, because this is when Garrett was faltering. in that closer role. Diaz had already had his woes and stuff like that. You're really looking for guys to rely upon, and it was too early to trade for bullpen, especially considering the Mets didn't have a good record at the time. I view him as a massive piece of what helped save this season because he was such a reliable presence in that bullpen. So to see him not on the projected opening day roster is pretty baffling to me. But it also speaks to how much competition there is for bullpen spots right now, which of course is a very good thing.
Yeah, I agree. With everything he said, he was one of the, when we were talking in the postseason on TV and with our podcast here, he was one of the guys that you had to talk about. You know, it was the JD Martinez, it was Francisco Lindor, it was Manaea and Severino. Then out of the bullpen, Nunez was a true story because he came up when the Mets, because Diaz went down.
Right.
He was done. Reed Garrett proved that he couldn't be in that ninth inning role. And Nunez kind of stepped up and he was pitching on no days rest. He was pitching on 1 day's rest. He was pitching multiple innings. He was basically their Band-Aid to keep this team in a competitive area because he was capable of doing anything and he was effective and looked the same no matter what role it was. He fills the zone on a team that struggled mightily with throwing strikes. This guy fills the zone. He doesn't walk anybody. It was like he was like a savior in his style of pitching, and they carried him. And so I think he's going to be on this roster. I would be heartbroken for him if he doesn't make this team, if he has an average, healthy spring training.
Two things to mention here. You mentioned days rest. I just did some quick math. 40% of his 35 innings were thrown with 0 or 1 day's rest. For a guy that's new to a big league workload, that's going to affect him. And one thing that I think is going to be a deciding factor, non-injury related and non-performance related, are options. The Mets love their guys that have options. They love being able to manipulate the roster to best fit the team. Dedniel Nunez has 2 options. So if that is a reason for him starting the year at AAA, it makes sense in my brain, but it doesn't sit right with me as a Mets fan after watching what he did last year. Another guy that has 2 options and another guy that kind of fell to the background last year, Huascar Brazoban, who was acquired from the Marlins. It was a trade that we really liked because the Mets didn't give up much of anything to get him. The Marlins were just kind of selling everybody to sell everybody. A guy with a ton of years of control, but he came over and he just wasn't successful, wasn't very effective at all in the areas that the Mets used him after being, a 2.93 ERA in 30 innings with the Marlins. He's another guy that's going to be questionable to make the team. Right now, they don't have him on the opening day roster. Another guy I mentioned here with 2 options, so that could be a playing factor as well.
Yeah, Brazoban's an interesting case. At times, he looks like he lost confidence, and it's pretty, body language. You watch it. He was. I don't know if it was because he's so big and so long that he had a hard time, repeating his delivery, which is the bread and butter of any pitcher. His stuff just wasn't playing the way we saw him in Miami because he was probably, being a young guy and learning how to pitch in the big leagues on a team that isn't competitive gives you that, even if I don't do well, our team stinks, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm not costing us anything. And I think he slid into that role with the Mets, understanding that every out that he throws, every pitch that he throws has a lot more weight to it. I think he struggled a little bit. He's got big time stuff, but I imagine he'll be an up and down guy to fill in when they need him to, simply because he has options and because of his inconsistency that he showed last year.
Yeah, so he's going to be an interesting case here. I kind of view him as a long shot to just make the roster as it stands right now, but he's definitely in play, and the Mets view him as a piece of this bullpen. We haven't talked about a lefty yet.
I thought we would do that next too, so I'm glad you pointed to it. I think it's an important role, but it's one that you can lump together. And this is one thing that the Mets were missing big time last year, is a lefty that can come in and get Bryce Harper out, can get Shohei Ohtani out in a big situation. Danny Young had some growing pains last year, inconsistency in throwing strikes. He's got a really nasty slider. He throws that low arm angle He's got a good fastball that plays way up because it's unorthodox and guys don't see it a lot. And so they brought in a guy like AJ Minter, which is huge for them. I think he's going to be huge for this team. He's got that nasty cutter. He's coming off of hip surgery, much like what David Peterson came off. I expect him to be healthy once the opening day is still in the picture and they're thinking about it. But if he misses, the first week of the spring or of the season, to make sure that he's healthy and 100%, I would be okay with that too. But to me, Minter is their lockdown lefty in that bullpen.
Yeah, Minter's an interesting discussion here, and it's going to be between these two guys, or potentially they'll both be on the roster at the same time. It helps to have two lefties. But yeah, this is a role that the Mets have been trying to fill for a while. I mean, Jake Diekman was the plan last year, and it just did not work. I mean, massive control issues, which is something we knew about going in, but just ineffective. I mean, he did have the highlight of striking out Aaron Judge, which I still remember. I was at that game, and I couldn't believe it when it happened.
That's a moment of last year's season for sure.
That was, I think, a June game when they started turn the corner.
Everybody was asking Mendoza, what are you doing?
Yeah, why is he in a one-run game?
Guy?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sometimes you just know.
The lefty situation's an interesting one. Danny Young, I believe, is out of options, so he's either going to be on the roster or, possibly picked up by another team. So it'll be interesting how they play and see him moving forward. But they also have a guy like Genesis Cabrera in as a non-roster invitee who has electric stuff. He looked great, and then he showed why he was a non-roster invitee by letting up some runs, had some walks.
Yeah.
So they brought in him. They brought in who's the other lefty? Anthony Gose, who's a
former outfielder.
Throws 100 from the left side. He has lights out stuff, but he's had some bumps and bruises in his career. They need two, I believe, especially in this division with a lot of lefty guys. It would be nice to be able to have both. But you really need at least one to be consistent, and having two allows those guys to kind of balance out their approach. Some guys are, have trouble with high velocity, so a guy like Genesis Cabrera or Gose or even Minter could be that guy. And then you have guys that struggle with left-on-left breaking balls, and that could be your Danny Young style guy.
Yeah, I mean, just to refresh everyone's memory, Danny Young had put together a really solid year. Up until early September, he had a 2.70 ERA in 33 innings over the course of 34 games from early May to early September. So he was a part of this team for pretty much the entire year. He just had a really tough end of the year. And as a reliever, you know this, a couple tough outings, it balloons all your stats, and suddenly the perception can change pretty quick. So I'm very curious about Danny Young. We know the stuff is nasty. He's another guy that is going to be, walks will be the bane of his existence, but it just kind of plays into his arsenal. Minter, I'm curious. Of all the signings the Mets made this offseason, I'd say I liked most, if not all of them. The Montas one was a little questionable, and you see why with his injury. Minter was the other one, because he's coming off hip surgery, which is, we just talked about this with David Peterson. It's not like you can't have success after hip surgery, but it is a little bit scary because that is a massive surgery, I think, for a pitcher. And the Mets gave him a lot of money, a pretty player-friendly contract, if I had to give my opinion on it. And, coming with the baggage of being on the division rival for many, many years, it is an odd fit. But if he's able to pan out, we've seen some pretty spectacular seasons from AJ Minter not that long ago. In 2022, he threw 70 innings with a 2 ERA and was worth 2 WAR as just kind of a middle relief guy for the Braves, in their stacked bullpen. If that guy is still in the tank, he becomes such a weapon for the Mets. It's not only just a lefty reliever, it's a high leverage guy. It's a setup guy. It's a guy that's closed games before. But I think his range of where he could land is so big for me, because I think we're going to see him early in the season. I don't think he'll be ready for opening day. He just threw to live batters for the first time last week. I think the Mets will be very cautious because, like we mentioned, they have a ton of options. But I think the range of where he lands is going to be pretty wide. Whereas guys like Budo, guys like Garrett, even, Ryan Stanik, who I still view as a wild card, I feel like you'd have a semblance of what you might get with them. With AJ Minter, he had a tough 2023 and then rebounded last year, but in limited time because of the injury. I'm very curious. I'm a little scared, but I'm optimistic.
I love AJ Minter. Former teammate, got to share a bullpen with him in Atlanta in 2019. The guy's a competitor, and he has, you can't downplay an injury to your hip any more than what we saw from David Peterson. It
Mm.
just zaps you of your power. That everything derives from your lower half, and when it's a hip injury is often a gradual thing, and so it plays over time. It's not usually just like a pop, you feel it like Tommy John to where it's over. It eats at you and pulls you out of your mechanics slowly over an entire season. So I think his 2023 was affected by that, and then obviously it got to a point where he needed the surgery. Same with David Peterson. I expect him with a healthy hip to be at 100%. I expect that fastball to be in the 95, 96 range, which is where it's truly effective. His cutter is elite against both lefties and righties. He dots that up, and that's at like a 90-mile-per-hour range. Then he started to really develop a changeup to keep people off, something that fades into a lefty away from a righty because all of his stuff moves towards right-handed batters. I think that's a true weapon, a three-pitch guy that has that kind of stuff. He's going to play a great role, and I expect him to return to that 2022 form.
I sure hope so, because then this Mets bullpen gets a lot more impressive. And this is a bullpen that's mostly under control for the foreseeable future. It looks like this is going to be the unit. You got Budo and Reed Garrett that are ARB guys. Diaz obviously has the big contract. Minter has a multi-year deal as well. There were a lot of parts out from the 2025 team or the 2024 team, including Adam Ottavino, who had been here for quite a while and kind of evened out to solid numbers towards the end of the season. We mentioned Diekman before. Hauser was a midseason cut. Phil Maton was not brought back in his option, and no team picked him up, which really surprised me because you look at his regular season numbers with the Mets, and they're very, very good. He's another guy that struggled in the postseason, of course. And then Jorge Lopez, who found a home with our division rival Washington Nationals. One guy that was a free agent that the Mets did bring back, though, is Drew Smith, who's going to spend the year rehabbing. I was very happy to see him stay with the fold. He's one of the longest tenured Mets. We probably won't see him this year, but I felt it was worth mentioning that he's back with the team.
I agree. I think bringing back Drew Smith, he is the longest tenured pitcher on this roster. Second longest outside of Brandon Nimmo.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. Hard
cool
for a reliever to do that, but he's got high potential. Everybody's seen what he's capable of doing when he's at his best. He's a key piece there. You mentioned some of the guys that are still out there. There's a lefty out there by the name of Brooks Raley who looked amazing in a Mets uniform. He did awesome. His injury really hurt the Mets early in the season because they were relying on him so much. I don't know why he doesn't have a job. Probably a non-roster invitee was the only thing he could get, and I don't understand that at all. If he's healthy, I could see the Mets making a move here. Keeping tabs, keeping in contact, but I think this Mets team has the depth. They don't need to go out and get another guy. They have Max Kranick, who could be the long guy. They have multiple options like that. So I love the depth. I love the back end talent. This is a really, really good unit, and they're going to be needed big time to fill in more innings than they're used to.
Yeah, quickly on Raley, he threw 8 times in the first 16 games of the Mets season, so that speaks to the workload and how much they relied on him. And we haven't gotten an update on him since early January, where the Yankees and Cubs checked in, most likely for what you said, a non-roster invite. So yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense in my mind if the Mets want to continue stacking not only lefty options, but just guys that have done it in a Mets uniform and done it well. He'd be a very welcome addition on some kind of team-friendly contract, considering his injury. The last guys here are Max Kranick, like you mentioned. Paul Blackburn is in here as a long reliever, and then McGill and Canning are currently in the rotation, but they could end up in the bullpen. I think we'll probably pocket them for when we do the rotation episode next week, because I think all 4 of those guys figure to get starting opportunities, or at the very least long relief opportunities. So it feels like it lends itself to that discussion a little bit more. Do you have any parting notes on the Mets bullpen?
No, I don't. Nothing of significance except for the fact that I really like the way this unit is shaped. I like the depth. You've seen what you need out of them, and then the more they chip away at the starting rotation, the more injuries that pile up there, the more impactful those non-back end guys, those middle relief, the more high leverage innings these guys are going to get. And they're shaped up to be able to handle that load on a full season basis because of how deep they are.
Yeah, I always go back to the 2021 team when I think about how far the Mets have come in terms of depth, in terms of building out their roster. 42 different pitchers threw a pitch that year for the Mets. And a lot of them are guys that was their final year in the big leagues, and they were picked up off scrap heaps and signed in the middle of the season. And it's so cool to see that, like, you know, it's obviously not cool for these guys. They want to be major leaguers, but you look at their AAA bullpen right now, and I feel like this might be a better bullpen than like the White Sox. Like Dedniel Nunez, Huascar Brazaban, Tyler Zuber, who was a midseason acquisition last year, still hasn't made the team. Sean Reed Foley's in that bullpen too. Like that is those are major league arms that are just kind of sitting and waiting for an opportunity and want to be with this organization because they know like the culture and how, you know, impressive this roster is becoming talent wise. So I'm very excited to see this Mets bullpen take a step forward this year because, you know, they ended the year evened out in the rankings and they're mostly middle of the pack and everything. And I think that this bullpen is capable of a lot more considering how nasty all these guys are, how hard they throw, and how many options the Mets have provided themselves with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the big note from the year before was the walks. We knew it would come back to bite you at some point during the season. And then in that Dodgers series, it was just exploited. The Dodgers do an unbelievable job of identifying a team's weakness and exploiting it. With the Mets, it was walks, and they were so patient as a group, making especially the bullpen come into the zone and do damage. And then you saw it in the World Series. They identified, you know, team defense and base running as an area that the Yankees lacked, and they exploited that. So with a year of seasoning, I expect the walks to still kind of be high because swing and miss stuff plays over a long season. But now with that season under your belt, when they approach a team like the Dodgers in a series, they can sharpen their approach a lot more and understanding that they still have to do what made them effective. But with the knowledge that this team's going to be patient, you fill the zone early and make them chase late versus make them chase early because a team like that simply doesn't do it. I expect them to evolve a little bit and understand their opponent a little bit more in major series like that.
All the tools are there. It's going to come down to execution, and I'm excited to see this unit come back together and get another crack at it, hopefully, in another playoff run. But that'll do it for our discussion on the bullpen. If we miss someone, it's probably because they're going to get discussed in next Monday's episode, which is our final team profile and projection episode, all about the starting rotation. After that episode, it'll be regular season baseball, which is really exciting. But thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe on the YouTube channel if you listen there. If you're on a podcast app, leave us a review. It goes a incredibly long way, and we really appreciate it. I read all of them, just so you know. So thank you guys so much for listening. We will see you next Monday for our final TPP, and then Mets baseball is officially here.
Can't wait. Let's go Mets.
LFGM, baby.